Rosemary Hale entered Snow Creek on a morning that felt older than the world itself, when winter's breath wrapped every rooftop in pale silence, and the river behind the town crawled beneath sheets of ice. She walked with careful steps, carrying a cloth bag that held the sum of her life, 2 dresses, a comb, and a folded envelope with her husband's handwriting. Wind tugged at her shawl as if trying to take it away, but she kept walking, because stopping meant feeling the hunger gnaw under her ribs. Her arrival went unnoticed at first. Wagons groaned along the muddy street, hooves struck the frozen earth, and merchants swept snow from their doorways. Rosemary's beauty, the kind that suggested quiet endurance rather than vanity, softened nothing about her circumstances. People respected her face, but no one paused long enough to see the tired light in her eyes. She had crossed 3 small towns since her husband died from fever, leaving her with debt the way storms leave timber broken and roofs torn open. The first building she approached was a bakery, its windows glowing with lantern light. Bread steamed near the counter, the scent drifting across the room like comfort meant for others. She asked the baker if he had any work, sweeping floors, scrubbing kettles, washing rags, but he shook his head before the sentence left her lips. Winter made coins cling tightly to pockets. She bowed, thanked him, and went back into the cold. She tried the general store next, where fabric hung in folded colors and nails sat in wooden crates. The merchant, Elias Buckley, tall and precise with numbers, leaned against a ledger. He recognized Rosemary from a neighboring settlement, where she once helped her husband sell jars of berries. Elias had admired her quietly back then, though she never encouraged him. Now, seeing her alone, he offered no sympathy. He looked at her clothes and saw hardship, and hardship made some men uncomfortable. Rosemary asked if he needed help counting supplies, mending linens, or delivering parcels. Elias studied her with a gaze that held more judgment than interest. He told her business was too slow, though his shelves said otherwise. She thanked him anyway and stepped outside, feeling the weight of disappointment settle on her shoulders. Every door she tried closed before she fully knocked. Laundry, schoolhouse, a small hotel with empty rooms but no wage to spare. Hunger lived in the heart when strangers turned their backs before learning a person's name. By afternoon, her legs shook from exhaustion, and she sat behind the abandoned chicken shed outside the mill. She pressed her palms to her eyes, not from grief, but from the fear that grief would finally break the silence she fought to maintain. She remembered her husband, Henry Hale, kind and earnest, who carved spoons to fill their cupboards and taught her to laugh at storms instead of hiding from them. His death came quickly, like a candle snuffed by an unseen hand. When Henry closed his eyes for the final time, creditors arrived within days. They stood in the doorway like crows sensing harvest, demanding payment she could never offer. The cabin where they spent 2 winters was taken without mercy. Rosemary left with a single dress and Henry's envelope, a promise he once wrote that the world would be gentler than it seemed. Night whispered across Snow Creek faster than she expected. Lanterns blinked inside houses where families gathered around hot stews and warm fires. Rosemary curled herself beneath broken boards and straw, adjusting her shawl over her knees. The ground felt harder than any bed she had known. She thought if sleep arrived, hunger might loosen its grip for a few hours. She awoke before dawn when the wind rattled the shed. Her fingers had gone stiff, and breath collected in white clouds before her lips. She stepped outside, stretching arms and legs until they remembered movement. The river behind the town murmured under a sheet of ice. Rosemary knelt beside the water, washing her face with its cold clarity. She whispered a prayer into her cupped palms. Not for comfort, but for purpose. A voice startled her gently. Martha Wills, the town's midwife, held a small basket with bread and a jar of broth. Martha had silver at her temples and eyes that recognized strength long before understanding circumstance. She asked where Rosemary had slept, and Rosemary pointed toward the shed without shame. Martha sighed and placed the basket in Rosemary's hands, as though there were no choice in the matter. They sat together near the frozen creek, sharing broth and silence. Martha asked about Henry only once, and Rosemary answered with soft honesty. Martha listened without interruption. She said Snow Creek could be difficult for strangers in winter, but not impossible. She told Rosemary of a rancher named Strong Elk, an Apache man who lived a mile beyond the cottonwoods. She spoke his name like someone describing steady rain. He hired workers during winter, paid fairly, and treated animals as kin. Some settlers feared him, not for anything he had done, but for prejudice. Martha said he valued steady hands and honest spirits more than gossip. Rosemary listened, torn between uncertainty and hope. She wrapped the last crumbs of bread in cloth, promising to return the basket when she could. Martha kissed her forehead as if blessing a daughter she had only just met. When morning light rose like a thin silver spine over the horizon, Rosemary walked toward the cottonwoods, every step a quiet vow to keep moving. Her breath trailed behind her like smoke from a fragile ember. Ahead, the path wound beyond fences and empty meadows. Her heart trembled not from fear, but from the sudden realization that the world might still offer shelter in places she had never imagined. She whispered to herself that destiny sometimes waits just beyond the edge of discouragement, and the cold morning felt like the beginning of something new. Rosemary followed the winding path that Martha had described, passing weathered cottonwoods whose branches bowed like old sentinels. Snow drifted between them in slow spirals, covering the ground with a pale hush. Beyond the trees, pastures stretched across the valley, fenced with rough timber and crowned by distant hills. The sky felt wide enough to hold every unspoken sorrow she had carried since Henry died. She pressed her shawl against the wind and continued toward the cluster of buildings. As she neared, she heard the rhythmic crack of an axe. Each swing echoed like deliberate thunder. A man stood near a stack of firewood, splitting cedar with steady precision. He rose enormous against the winter backdrop, tall and muscular, his skin bronzed by seasons of labor rather than comfort. His hair, long and dark, brushed his shoulders. He wore no shirt, though frost glittered on the earth around him. Steam drifted from his body, the warmth of a man who worked harder than cold could threaten. She approached slowly, unsure if she should speak while he worked. Yet before she called out, he paused mid-swing, sensing her presence without turning. He set the axe aside and faced her. His eyes were calm, resembling river stones shaped by patience and grief. She introduced herself softly, explaining that she sought work and had been sent by Martha. Her voice trembled with the weight of uncertainty, though she stood straight, unwilling to present herself as helpless. Strong Elk looked at her, as if reading more than her words. He studied her worn shoes, her wind-chapped cheeks, and the quiet dignity she carried like a final possession. Instead of questioning her origins, he asked whether she was hungry. She admitted she was, though pride made the confession quiet. Without ceremony, Kama guided her toward a cabin where a kettle simmered over the hearth. He ladled broth into a tin cup and placed it into her hands. She drank slowly, warmth flooding her chest like relief. When she finished, Kama asked what work she could do. Rosemary listed her skills in a voice steadier than before. She could cook, mend clothes, wash linens, sweep barns, and care for horses. Kama nodded thoughtfully, saying each task mattered during winter. He did not rush. Silence stretched comfortably between them, as though silence itself could listen. He walked with her across the ranch, explaining that he raised horses and a few cattle, selling meat and hides to towns beyond Snow Creek. Workers who stayed for short seasons used the small cabin nearby. He pointed toward it with emotion both offering and cautious, as though inviting someone into his home required more than wages. Rosemary asked about payment, though she feared her question might sound ungrateful. Kama answered plainly. She would receive wages, supper, and a warm bed. He said the winter required loyalty, not servitude. She could leave if ever she wished, and he would never keep her by obligation. His voice carried no arrogance. It held steadiness, like the quiet after a storm. Rosemary felt moved by his fairness, yet worry lingered. She asked why he trusted a stranger who could disappear, offering more kindness than he might receive in return. Kama replied that winter taught honesty better than ledgers could. A person who arrived hungry rarely carried schemes. Hunger stripped vanity away. Rosemary understood the truth behind his words and thanked him softly. Throughout the morning, Kama showed her the barn where horses breathed warm clouds into the air. Their coats shimmered beneath lantern light. Rosemary touched the flank of a roan mare, surprised when the animal leaned gently against her hand. Kama observed without comment, though a faint softness crossed his features. He explained that horses recognized stillness in people before recognizing strength. Rosemary flushed, humbled by the compliment. Kama helped her organize laundry near the creek, where linens froze stiff before thawing near the fire. He lifted buckets with effortless grace, while Rosemary scrubbed with practiced hands. Side by side, they worked without forcing conversation. She sensed that Kama valued unspoken harmony as much as words. When he did speak, his sentences flowed like thoughts long considered. He asked little about Henry at first, letting her grief remain private. Only when she volunteered details did he respond, offering reflections instead of pity. He said the frontier had taken his brother years ago, a life stolen not by sickness but by fear between settlers and Apache tribes. His tone carried sorrow without bitterness. Rosemary felt an aching kinship, as though two distant storms had recognized each other. Later that evening, as shadows stretched across the yard, a horse's cry startled Rosemary. She ran toward the barn, finding Kama inside, calming a restless stallion whose hoof had been cut by a loose nail. Kama knelt beside the animal, speaking soft words that sounded like prayer. Rosemary watched him wrap the wound carefully, his hands patient, his eyes filled with unwavering respect. She sensed that his gentleness was not weakness but devotion. When the stallion finally relaxed, Kama stood, wiping his hands on a rag. Rosemary thanked him for letting her witness such tenderness. He smiled faintly, saying animals deserved loyalty long before humans learned how to earn it. She considered how rare it was for a man to speak of loyalty without demanding it. Not long after, Elias Buckley arrived at the ranch, his horse kicking snow with restless hooves. He greeted Rosemary politely, though the tone carried something sharp beneath the surface. Elias told Kama he should reconsider hiring a widow who arrived without introduction or wealth. He warned that merchants in town might refuse to buy Apache beef if Kama hosted someone troublesome. His words sounded like caution, though jealousy pulsed through them. Kama did not raise his voice. He stood between Rosemary and Elias as if his presence alone could shape the air. He told Elias that work was work, character was character, and commerce did not frighten him. Elias muttered about reputations and loyalty, losing confidence as Kama's silence deepened. He eventually left, leaving frost swirling from his horse's hooves. When Elias disappeared into the trees, Rosemary apologized to Kama for bringing trouble upon him. Kama said trouble arrived without permission during winter, and kindness remained the only shelter worth keeping. He instructed her to rest inside the cabin and unpack her few belongings. As night settled over the ranch, Rosemary sat beside the glowing hearth, feeling fatigue soften into relief. Outside, Kama's footsteps moved across the snow as he checked lanterns. She listened, realizing she had been offered not just wages or food, but a chance to rebuild dignity without begging for permission. A fragile hope bloomed quietly, though she dared not name it yet. She whispered that storms could steal land, but storms could also lead a heart exactly where it needed to be. Rosemary learned the rhythms of the ranch one patient morning at a time, as though winter itself softened its breath whenever she moved with purpose. She woke before daylight, sweeping the path between the cabins until lanterns painted long ribbons of gold across the snow. Kama's strong elk often worked outside before dawn, running his palm along each horse's flank as he checked blankets and tightened straps. Rosemary admired how his strength never arrived with theatrics. His hands moved with the precision of someone who understood that force belonged only to storms, not to living creatures that depended on him. She prepared porridge and coffee, leaving bowls near the hearth. Kama rarely ate quickly. He sat with a grateful stillness, as if every meal deserved appreciation. Rosemary watched him from across the cabin when she washed wooden spoons or folded linens. His silence never felt heavy. It gave her space to breathe without needing to impress anyone. Some men filled the air with their importance, but Kama made room for peace. Throughout the afternoons, Rosemary joined him near the stables, caring for horses with slow, methodical attention. She brushed their coats, whispering gentle reassurances, and Kama occasionally corrected her grip with a quiet touch that felt more like guidance than command. The animals grew used to her presence, snorting softly whenever she entered, as though they recognized a woman who did not rush their trust. Each small task became more than labor. It reminded her that honest work belonged to dignity, not desperation. Kama offered fair wages without speaking about charity. She saved every coin in a small tin under her mattress, not because she dreamed of escape, but because saving allowed her to believe in a future again. At times, she found herself telling Kama stories about Henry, though she never described the sharpest memories. Kama listened gently. He did not coddle her or offer empty consolation. He respected grief as a guest that arrived without invitation. In return, Rosemary asked about his brother, and Kama shared fragments of childhood. Hunting with elders, learning songs before firelit nights, and the quiet sorrow of a family guarded by silence after loss. His voice never trembled, but the pauses between sentences carried an ache Rosemary recognized. One afternoon, Rosemary witnessed Kama guiding a skittish mare through a narrow gate. The animal reared, terrified by shadows from the barn's open door. Kama did not shout or tighten the rope. He stepped beside the mare, breathing with her until her fear eased. Rosemary asked how he understood creatures so deeply. Kama answered that horses trusted rhythm more than power, and rhythm could be offered without force. She repeated the idea to herself long after he walked away, realizing people needed rhythm as much as animals. As days turned into weeks, the ranch became a sanctuary, where she felt herself slowly returning from a place she had not known she had disappeared into. Her hands grew surer. Her step gained steadiness. The hollow fear she carried after Henry's death softened. Kama never said she looked stronger, but he saw it. When she laughed once at the sight of a stubborn calf refusing to enter the manger, Kama looked up as if hearing music he had forgotten existed. Snowstorms came and went, swirling around the ranch like restless ocean waves. Some nights, wind rattled the shutters with wild insistence. Rosemary lay awake, listening to the groaning wood and remembering the years when fear lived in the dark corners of her life. Now, she felt less alone. The fire inside the stove crackled like a living witness. She reminded herself that safety could arrive quietly, one shared moment after another. The town, however, carried its own storms. Elias Buckley spread whispered judgments in the saloon, suggesting that Rosemary stayed on the ranch for motives other than labor. He told men that widows learned quickly how to survive through charm, implying more than he understood. Those rumors traveled like smoke, thin yet persistent. Rosemary heard fragments whenever she visited the mill to gather grain. No one confronted her, but she felt eyes linger just long enough to create unease. Kama noticed her discomfort even before she spoke of it. He said Snow Creek preferred stories to truth during winter, because stories warmed empty hours. He advised her not to surrender her spirit to voices that required imagination to remain vicious. She nodded, grateful for the steadiness in his tone, though worry still brushed the edges of her peace. One bitter afternoon, Rosemary slipped on frozen mud while carrying buckets from the creek. The heavy container tipped, soaking her skirts in icy water. She gasped as cold slashed against her legs. Before she could stand, Kama appeared beside her, lifting her with effortless strength. He guided her into the cabin, wrapping blankets around her, and lighting the stove until steam rose from her clothes. Rosemary felt tears sting her eyes, not from pain, but from the surprise of being cared for without hesitation. From that day forward, their companionship deepened without ceremony. Kama began leaving warm tea outside her door on nights when wind howled like hungry wolves. Rosemary never asked how he sensed her loneliness. He simply seemed to feel sorrow without explanation. She returned gestures in small ways, extra spices in stew, a mended blanket, a carefully patched sleeve. Neither spoke of intimacy, though its presence lingered like a quiet ember. Sometimes, they spent evenings near the hearth, discussing constellations or stories from his tribe. Rosemary confessed she feared forgetting parts of herself that existed before grief. Kama told her that identity could be restored through presence, not memory. She stared into the fire, absorbing the idea with gratitude. Yet conflict waited just beyond the edges of comfort. One morning, Sheriff Porter visited the ranch, asking whether Rosemary felt safe or pressured to stay. Elias had implied she was being held against her will. Kama's jaw tightened, though he kept his voice steady. Rosemary assured the sheriff she remained freely, with wages and respect. Porter apologized and left. As he disappeared across the pasture, Rosemary sensed the winds of rumor were not finished, and the ranch might soon face a storm no amount of kindness could quiet. Winter sharpened its teeth as January settled over Snow Creek, making every fence post shimmer with ice and every breath rise like ghostly steam. Rosemary woke earlier than usual, restless from dreams that felt too heavy for a woman who had learned to sleep again. She stepped outside the cabin, wrapped in a thick shawl, and watched the ranch yard blur beneath gently falling snow. Kama was already splitting wood, his movements even and unhurried. She admired the strength in his shoulders, though today his quietness felt heavier than she could explain. Rumors had not disappeared. They multiplied like frost over still water. Whenever Rosemary rode into town for flour, she sensed judgment before hearing a word spoken. Elias Buckley's voice carried farther than his honesty ever had. He described Rosemary as a wandering widow who found comfort at Kama's ranch in ways that had little to do with wages. Men repeated his assertions without reflection, and women whispered into shawls, claiming hospitality could be mistaken for impropriety. Rosemary tried to ignore them, but slander had a way of rooting itself deeper than truth. One afternoon, she returned from town with a small sack of beans. The wind pushed against her, as though trying to warn her to stay away from gossiping voices. When she reached the ranch, Kama stepped out of the barn and asked gently if something troubled her. She told him she had overheard two men in the saloon saying she would eventually break Kama's business, because merchants would refuse to trade with an Apache, who took in a woman without family or escort. Kama's expression remained calm, yet his eyes tightened as though absorbing unwanted pain. He reassured her that Snow Creek would not dictate how he offered shelter. She whispered that she did not want to cost him stability. He shook his head and answered that stability built on fear was never true stability. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth of his voice steady her heartbeat. Still, fear lingered. She had known loss so intimately that she worried survival might require leaving again before someone else paid a price for her presence. 2 weeks later, the first true blizzard arrived like a wild congregation of roaring wind and stinging snow. It blew through the valley with ferocity, rattling rooftops and bending fences. Rosemary and Kama spent hours reinforcing the barn doors and thickening blankets for the horses. The animals trembled under the din, stamping hooves and tossing their heads. Rosemary calmed them as best she could, whispering into their manes while Kama secured latches against the mounting storm. By nightfall, the world beyond the ranch seemed swallowed by white fury. Frost crawled across the windows like searching fingers. Rosemary prepared thick stew over the stove, and Kama checked the lanterns every hour. When he returned to the cabin, Rosemary noticed tension around his mouth, an uneasiness that did not belong to weather. Before she could ask, a distant bark of dogs pierced the wind, followed by voices carried through the storm. Kama extinguished the lantern nearest the door and stepped outside to listen. Rosemary followed him, clutching her shawl as snow lashed across her face. 3 riders approached, their silhouettes chiseled by moonlight and swirling ice. Elias Buckley led them, wrapped in a thick coat, hat pulled low, posture tense with certainty. Elias dismounted and strode forward, shouting that Rosemary must come with them. He announced she had stolen linens and money from the general store weeks ago, that Sheriff Porter had been informed, and that townsfolk demanded she be interrogated. Rosemary froze, stunned by the cruelty of the invention. She could barely breathe. Elias's voice rose above the wind, claiming Kama was harboring a thief to protect his own interests. Kama stepped between Elias and Rosemary, his presence steady as a fortress. He demanded proof. Elias gestured toward a saddlebag as though its contents would settle the matter, though the accusation felt flimsy and desperate. Rosemary shook her head, insisting she had stolen nothing, that her work had been honest every single day. Elias mocked her desperation, insisting sorrow could become a mask for manipulation. The storm howled above their argument, tossing snow like judgment. One of Elias's companions looked uncertain, glancing at Rosemary with discomfort, but fear of town opinion kept him silent. Elias reminded Kama that business could be destroyed by scandal, and merchants would gladly boycott beef from a ranch where a widow lived without clear purpose. Rosemary's legs buckled beneath the implication, not because she believed Elias, but because other people might. The frontier often judged before verifying truth. Kama raised his voice, not in anger but in command. He told Elias that Rosemary earned her wages with dignity and loyalty, and no one who understood honesty would question her worth. He reminded Elias that hospitality was not a crime, and if Snow Creek needed scandal to survive winter boredom, scandal belonged to those who invented it. Elias bristled, insisting that Kama's defiance proved guilt. He stretched out his arm, demanding Rosemary be surrendered to the town. Rosemary whispered that she would leave if necessary, not wanting violence or consequence for Kama. Her voice cracked, breaking open the fear she had carried since Henry died, the fear of being the reason someone else suffered. Kama turned toward her, his expression soft but unwavering. He told her that fear often masqueraded as sacrifice, and leaving would only satisfy those who thrived on destruction. She looked at him, and saw not a man defending property, but a man defending truth. Sheriff Porter arrived moments later, his horse laboring through the storm. He had been summoned by Martha, who suspected Elias intended to create trouble under the cloak of darkness. Porter dismounted and questioned Elias calmly, asking for evidence. Elias repeated his claims, gesturing toward items supposedly stolen. Porter inspected each object and shook his head. None bore Rosemary's stitching or Kama's markings. Elias's face flushed with humiliation. Porter announced that no crime had been committed and no arrest would occur. He warned Elias that false allegations carried heavier shame than winter hunger. Elias sputtered with indignation, but Porter's voice ended the argument. The storm seemed to hush around the decision. Elias and his men mounted reluctantly and disappeared into white obscurity, leaving a bitter silence behind. When they were gone, Rosemary collapsed into tears she had suppressed for months, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. She whispered apologies, afraid. Kama touched her shoulder, letting his warmth replace panic. He told her sorrow did not belong to the innocent. She looked into his eyes and realized she finally believed him. Yet even as comfort settled over them, a deeper turning stirred beneath the moment. Leaving might not save her, and staying might require a courage she had never imagined for herself. The storm refused to sleep, shaking the roof as though trying to pull the ranch from its foundations. Rosemary stayed near the hearth while Kama checked the barn again, lantern swinging against the wind. When he returned, snow clung to his hair and shoulders, yet he looked untroubled, like a man who understood that nature's fury did not mean personal malice. Rosemary watched him remove his gloves and shake warmth back into his hands. Her fear had not vanished, but it no longer felt like a threat that would swallow her alone. She thanked him for defending her earlier, though the words sounded too thin. Kama said truth defended itself through patience, not argument. She sat at the table, fingers trembling around a mug of tea, realizing she had never known anyone who protected her without needing something in return. Henry had been a good man, yet illness had made him fragile, leaving her to carry burdens she never named aloud. Now she understood that safety could feel like a room where breath did not need permission. Snow hammered against the shutters, and the horses cried out in the distance. Kama stood again, hearing distress in the sound. Rosemary insisted on helping, refusing to let him face the storm alone. Together they hurried into the barn, breath fogging the air, stepping through drifts of snow gathered against the door. Inside, horses stamped and snorted, eyes wide from thunder cracking overhead. Rosemary stroked a chestnut mare's neck until the creature relaxed, leaning into her like a child seeking comfort. Kama tightened the bracing planks and whispered steady rhythms that settled even the most restless animals. Lightning flashed across the valley, illuminating the storm like a curtain of silver needles. Rosemary clutched her shawl, glancing toward the hills where Elias had vanished earlier. She imagined his resentment twisting in the dark, hungry for fresh opportunity. She wondered if cruelty carried more stamina than honesty. Kama sensed her unease without needing explanation. He said storms revealed more than weather. They revealed a person's impulses. When the barn finally steadied, they returned inside the cabin, soaked and bone-weary. Rosemary lit the stove again, drying their coats and socks, and Kama silently ladled stew into 2 wooden bowls. They ate near the fire, savoring warmth more than flavor. The storm began to settle, though its echo lingered through the walls like distant drums. Rosemary wrapped her arms around herself, no longer shivering from cold, but from the quiet after danger. Safety sometimes made the heart shake harder than threat. Kama leaned forward, voice gentle but firm, asking why she apologized before tears spilled earlier. Rosemary felt her throat tighten, ashamed of the reflex that told her sorrow required permission. She whispered that life had taught her to hide grief, because grief made her appear fragile. Kama reminded her that fragility did not disqualify worth. She stared into the fire, letting his words settle into the hollow places where fear had nested. Silence stretched between them, but it felt alive rather than empty. Kama watched her with an expression that held admiration without expectation. Rosemary sensed a truth forming like dawn behind heavy clouds, but she did not rush toward it. She wanted to meet it without trembling. Then lantern light flickered against the window, startling both of them. The sheriff had returned, leading Martha with him. They had braved the storm to ensure Elias would not attempt a second confrontation. Martha embraced Rosemary, relieved she had not been dragged into scandal. Porter carried a sternness that hinted at displeasure, promising he would speak with the town council about false accusations. He said the storm had revealed Elias's character more clearly than any courtroom could. They stayed for a short while, warming themselves near the hearth before leaving again. When the cabin door closed, the space grew immensely quiet. Rosemary felt the finality of their visit like a door closing on fear. The danger had not been imaginary. It had simply been defeated by truth. Kama sat near the fire, elbows resting on his knees. His posture looked strong yet profoundly tired. Rosemary studied him, seeing not only muscle but tenderness she had tried not to name. She thanked him again, this time without apology. Kama smiled faintly, saying gratitude was unnecessary. She insisted that loyalty had weight, and weight deserved recognition. Kama's smile deepened, eyes warming like sunlight on freshly thawed soil. Hours passed without urgency. Rosemary mended a torn glove, while Kama oiled leather straps for the harnesses. The storm softened until only quiet snow fell across the valley, sealing the ranch in white serenity. The world outside glowed beneath the moon, as though winter itself had been polished. Rosemary breathed deeply, feeling a peace she had forgotten possible. Kama paused his work and looked at her with unusual vulnerability. He said he had learned many forms of power, but none surprised him more than gentleness. Rosemary blinked, unsure whether to answer. He told her that she carried gentleness not as a weakness, but as a proof of endurance. The compliment touched her deeper than flattery ever could. She felt seen not for beauty, but for persistence. Rosemary stood, nervous energy fluttering beneath her ribs. She paced slowly near the stove, confessing she still feared being the cause of harm to his livelihood. Kama rose as well, crossing the room until only inches separated them. He answered simply, "Losing commerce was easier than losing honor." She stared at him, struck by the clarity in his tone. Love had not been spoken, yet something inside her recognized its shape. Her voice grew softer as she asked why he had defended her with such certainty, even when rumor might grow louder than truth. Kama breathed deeply, as though preparing to open a part of himself long protected. He said he had not protected her because she worked for him. He protected her because presence mattered more than contract. Winter had shown him that some souls entered one's life not for labor, but for belonging. Rosemary felt heat rise into her cheeks, unsure whether she should meet the meaning behind his words. Kama lifted her hand slowly, giving her space to withdraw if she wished. She did not. His fingers enveloped hers with warmth that felt both grounding and astonishing. His voice softened into something more intimate. He told her he admired her dignity, her resilience, her loyalty to truth over pride. And he confessed that each day she remained at the ranch, his home felt less like solitude and more like life. Rosemary's breath caught, and she whispered that she had been terrified to stay, because safety felt unfamiliar. Kama answered that unfamiliarity did not mean danger. Sometimes it meant destiny arriving without warning. She let tears fall freely, but they were not sorrowful. They were relief breaking at last. Kama leaned toward her, forehead resting against hers. He confessed that winter had taught him longing, not loneliness. He wished for a future where they worked not as strangers sharing labor, but as hearts sharing days, choices and rest. Rosemary trembled with realization that she had found more than wages. She had found a home shaped by respect rather than need. Outside, snow drifted gently, the storm finally surrendered. Rosemary whispered that she wanted to stay, not because she feared leaving, but because leaving would feel like abandoning the first place where she had been fully seen. Kama closed his eyes with a reverent sigh, as though hearing the ending to a prayer he had not dared speak aloud. The cabin felt warmer than any fire could explain. And for the first time in years, Rosemary understood that love did not enter with urgency. Love entered like a shelter that had been waiting all along, steady as winter turning into spring.